The fluorescent lights in the unemployment office buzzed overhead like angry wasps. As I sat in the plastic chair, my 75-year-old hands folded neatly in my lap. The caseworker, a young man barely out of college with kind eyes but a clipboard full of assumptions, cleared his throat and delivered the words that would echo in my mind for months to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mrs. Mitchell, I have to be honest with you. At your age, with the current job market, you're essentially unemployable. Have you considered assisted living? Maybe it's time to think about retirement activities, volunteer work perhaps. I stared at him, my silver hair perfectly styled despite the early morning appointment, my navy blazer pressed and professional. Behind me, the waiting room hummed with the quiet desperation of people seeking second chances. But what this young man didn't know, what his computer screen couldn't tell him, was that at that very moment, 500 people across 3 states were clocking into jobs that existed because of me. 500 paychecks were being signed by a company I had built from nothing, a corporation that bore my maiden name and carried the fingerprints of every risk I'd ever taken. But I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there because sometimes life strips you down to nothing, just to see if you remember who you really are. My name is Joanne Mitchell, though everyone calls me Joe, and this is the story of how the world tried to bury me alive, not knowing I was a seed. The morning that would change everything started like any other Thursday in my corner office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Chicago. I had arrived at 6:15, same as always, beating the rush of executives who thought arriving at 7:30 made them dedicated. My assistant Clara hadn't even made it in yet, but that was fine. I preferred the quiet hours when the city was still rubbing sleep from its eyes, and the phones hadn't started their relentless symphony. I had built Apex Solutions from a card table in my basement 23 years earlier, when I was 52 and supposedly past my prime for entrepreneurship. What started as a consulting firm helping small businesses navigate compliance issues had grown into a powerhouse that employed 517 people across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. We specialized in regulatory consulting, business development, and strategic planning for mid-sized companies that were too big for basic bookkeeping services, but too small for the major consulting giants to notice. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had spent decades helping other businesses survive and thrive, only to watch my own world crumble in a single morning phone call. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. When I answered, the voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and utterly devastating. Miss Mitchell, this is Derek Hawthorne from Consolidated Dynamics. I'm calling to inform you that as of today, we're exercising our option to accelerate the acquisition timeline. Your employment with Apex Solutions is terminated effective immediately, and you have 2 hours to clear your personal belongings from the premises. The words hit me like ice water. 6 months earlier, Consolidated Dynamics had approached me about acquiring Apex Solutions. They were a massive corporation, the kind that swallowed smaller companies whole and digested them into profit margin. I had resisted initially, but my board of directors, led by my former business partner Marcus Webb, had convinced me it was the smart move. Think of your legacy, Joe, Marcus had said, his voice smooth as silk. Think of the security this provides for everyone. What I hadn't realized was that the acquisition contract contained clauses that allowed them to terminate key personnel at their discretion during the transition period. What I also hadn't realized was that Marcus had been working behind the scenes to position himself as the new CEO, painting me as an aging figurehead who had lost touch with modern business practices. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. I founded this company. I am this company. Derek's laugh was polite but cold. Miss Mitchell, with respect, that's exactly the problem. Consolidated Dynamics is bringing Apex into the 21st century. We need leadership that understands digital transformation, artificial intelligence, and the modern workforce. Your contributions have been noted, but it's time for fresh blood. Fresh blood. At 75, I had apparently become stale wine, something to be poured down the drain to make room for a newer vintage. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my office, surrounded by the awards, photographs, and memorabilia of a career that had just been declared obsolete. Through my window, Chicago stretched out below me, a city I had helped build in my own small way, one successful business consultation at a time. The lake glittered in the distance, indifferent to the small human drama playing out in the tower above. Clara arrived at 7:45, her usual cheerful energy faltering when she saw my face. She had been with me for 8 years, a sharp young woman, who had started as a temp, and worked her way up to becoming my right hand. She knew every client, every deadline, every preference I had about how meetings should be run and coffee should be served. "Mrs. Mitchell, is everything all right?" I looked at her, this bright-eyed 30-year-old who still believed that hard work and loyalty were rewarded, and I realized I had about an hour to figure out how to tell her that her job might not exist tomorrow. "Clara, sit down. We need to talk." The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls, explanations, and the surreal process of packing up a life's work into cardboard boxes. Marcus arrived with security guards, his expression a careful mask of professional regret. "Joe, I'm sorry it had to happen this way," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But you have to understand, this is business. Consolidated has plans for expansion that require a different kind of leadership." Marcus Webb had been my business partner for 15 years before becoming a board member when the company went corporate. We had built our reputations together, weathered recessions, and market crashes side by side. I had been the creative force, the problem solver, the one who could walk into any business and see exactly what needed to be fixed. He had been the numbers man, the one who made sure we stayed profitable and grew strategically. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as an obstacle. "Different how?" I asked, folding a framed photo of our team from last year's company retreat. "Younger, more tech-savvy, more in tune with what clients need in today's market." I wanted to remind him that our client retention rate was 93%, that our revenue had grown every year for the past decade, that the today's market he was referring to was one I had been successfully navigating since before he graduated from business school. But I simply nodded and continued packing. The security guards were polite but firm. They escorted me to the elevator, past the cubicles and offices filled with people I had hired, trained, and mentored. Some of them looked up as I passed, confusion and concern written across their faces. Others kept their heads down, either unaware of what was happening, or unwilling to make eye contact with someone who had just become radioactive. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished steel door. I looked exactly like what I was, a well-dressed, dignified woman of 75 with silver hair, laugh lines, and the kind of confidence that comes from decades of making decisions and living with the consequences. But apparently, that reflection was no longer what success looked like. The lobby of the Meridian Tower was bustling with the usual morning energy. Young professionals strode across the marble floors, their heels clicking with purpose, their phones pressed to their ears as they conducted business that would shape the day ahead. I had been one of them once, though in my era we carried briefcases instead of laptops and used landlines instead of cell phones. The fundamentals hadn't changed as much as everyone liked to pretend. I stood on the sidewalk outside the building, holding a cardboard box containing 23 years of my professional life, and for the first time in decades, I had nowhere to go. The unemployment office was Clara's idea. She had called me that evening, her voice thick with tears and barely controlled rage. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is insane. They can't just throw you away like this. You built that company from nothing. Half the people in that building wouldn't have jobs if it weren't for you." I was sitting in my kitchen, still wearing the navy blazer I had put on that morning, when I thought I was going to work. My house felt too quiet, too still after the constant motion of the corporate world. "Clara, what's done is done. I'm not going to waste energy fighting something that's already over. But what will you do? You can't just retire. You're not the retiring type." She was right about that. The idea of golf courses and book clubs, and slowly fading into irrelevance, made my skin crawl. But what options did a 75-year-old woman have in a world that worshipped youth and dismissed Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Experience as obsolescence. I don't know yet, I admitted. But I'll figure something out. You should file for unemployment, Clara said. You paid into the system for decades. You're entitled to benefits while you figure out your next move. The suggestion felt absurd. I had never collected unemployment in my life, had never needed to. But Clara was right about one thing. I had paid into the system, and if nothing else, going through the process might give me time to think. The unemployment office was a monument to bureaucratic efficiency and human dignity stripped down to its most basic component. I filled out forms, provided documentation, and sat in plastic chairs designed by someone who had never spent 8 hours in one. The other applicants were mostly young people, recent graduates, or workers laid off from retail jobs and restaurants. I felt like an exotic bird that had wandered into the wrong habitat. When my number was finally called, I found myself sitting across from Tommy Rodriguez, the fresh-faced caseworker, who would become the inadvertent catalyst for everything that followed. Tommy was kind, earnest, and completely unprepared to deal with someone like me. He scrolled through my file on his computer, his eyebrows rising as he took in my employment history, education, and previous salary. Wow, Mrs. Mitchell, you have quite an impressive background. CEO of Apex Solutions for over 2 decades, MBA from Northwestern, extensive experience in business consulting. He looked up at me with genuine confusion. What happened? I gave him the abbreviated version: acquisition, termination, age discrimination, disguised as corporate restructuring. He nodded sympathetically, but I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how to help someone whose last job title was Chief Executive Officer. Well, let's see what's available, he said, turning back to his computer. There are some interesting opportunities here. Let's see, customer service representative at a call center. That pays $12 an hour, or there's a part-time position at a grocery store, 15 hours a week at minimum wage. Oh, here's something that might be more your speed. Administrative assistant at a small law firm, requires 5 years of experience, pays $18 an hour. I listened to him recite these options with the same feeling I imagine archaeologists have when they uncover evidence of a lost civilization. These weren't jobs for someone with my background. They were jobs for people just starting their careers or supplementing other income. But in the eyes of the employment system, a 75-year-old woman was the same as a 25-year-old high school graduate, a blank slate in need of basic employment. Tommy, I said gently, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't think any of these positions are quite the right fit. He looked back at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. The math wasn't adding up for him. How do you place someone who had been at the top of the food chain into an entry-level position? Mrs. Mitchell, I have to be honest with you. At your age, with the current job market, you're essentially unemployable. Have you considered assisted living? Maybe it's time to think about retirement activities, volunteer work perhaps. There it was, the word that would follow me for months, like a shadow I couldn't shake: unemployable. I smiled at Tommy, a real smile, not the polite mask I had been wearing since morning. Thank you for your honesty, Tommy. I appreciate it more than you know. I left the unemployment office with a folder full of job listings I would never apply for, and a new understanding of my place in the world. According to society, I was unemployable. According to the market, I was obsolete. According to everyone who mattered in the business world, I was finished. But as I walked to my car in the parking lot of that government building, something strange happened. Instead of feeling defeated, I felt liberated. For the first time in months, maybe years, I had a clear picture of exactly where I stood. I was 75 years old, had more business experience than most people would accumulate in 3 lifetimes, had built a company from nothing, and watched it employ hundreds of people, and the world had just told me I was worthless. The disconnect was so absurd it was almost fun. I sat in my car for a long time watching people come and go from the unemployment office, young faces full of hope and worry, middle-aged faces set with determination, older faces marked by resignation. All of them were here because someone, somewhere, had decided they weren't valuable enough to keep around. That's when I realized something that would change everything. The unemployment office wasn't full of unemployable people. It was full of people who had been discarded by a system that measured worth in all the wrong ways. And if there was one thing I had learned in 50+ years of working, it was that other people's discards often contained hidden treasure. I drove home with my folder of job listings and a strange sense of anticipation. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but for the first time since that phone call from Derek Hawthorne, I felt like I was driving toward something instead of away from. The house was quiet when I arrived, but it wasn't the oppressive silence I had felt that morning. It was the kind of quiet that holds possibility, like the moment before a symphony begins. I poured myself a glass of wine, spread the job listings across my dining room table, and began to read them with the analytical mind that had built Apex Solutions, not as potential opportunities for myself but as data points in a larger pattern I was just beginning to see. Customer service representatives, administrative assistants, retail associates, warehouse workers, all paying wages that wouldn't cover a mortgage in any decent neighborhood, all requiring experience that employers weren't willing to provide, all posted by companies that were probably struggling with turnover and wondering why they couldn't find good people anymore. I had spent my career helping businesses solve problems, and as I looked at those job listings, I saw a problem so big and so obvious that I couldn't believe I had never noticed it before. There was a massive disconnect between what employers needed and what they were willing to offer. They wanted experienced, reliable workers, but only wanted to pay entry-level wages. They wanted loyalty but offered no security. They wanted expertise but refused to invest in training. And on the other side were millions of people like the ones I had seen in the unemployment office, capable, willing to work, but shut out by a system that had stopped making sense somewhere along the way. It was a market inefficiency on a scale I had never encountered, and market inefficiencies were exactly the kind of problems I had built my career on solving. I refilled my wine glass and pulled out a legal pad, the same kind I had used to sketch out the business plan for Apex Solutions 23 years earlier. At the top of the page I wrote, "The problem." Under that I began to list everything I had observed. The aging workforce being pushed out of companies despite their experience, the younger workforce struggling to find jobs that paid living wages despite their education, the small and medium-sized businesses caught in the middle, unable to afford the high-end consulting services of major firms, but too complex for basic solutions. Then I started a new list. The solution. What if there was a company that specialized in connecting experienced workers with businesses that actually needed their expertise? What if instead of trying to fit square pegs into round holes, we created a system that recognized the value of experience while also addressing the real needs of modern businesses? What if the unemployable weren't unemployable at all, but were simply shopping in the wrong marketplace? I wrote until midnight, filling page after page with ideas, business models and possibilities. By the time I finally went to bed, I had the skeleton of a business plan, and something I hadn't felt in months, excitement about the future. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, my mind already racing with plans. I made coffee, sat down at my computer and began to research. I spent the next week diving deep into employment statistics, demographic trends, and market analysis. What I found confirmed everything I had suspected, and more. The workforce was aging rapidly, with people over 50 representing the fastest growing segment of the job market. But age discrimination, while illegal, was rampant and nearly impossible to prove. Companies routinely passed over older workers in favor of younger candidates, even when the older workers were more qualified. At the same time, businesses were struggling with retention, training costs, and finding workers who understood concepts like reliability, professional communication, and long-term thinking. It was a perfect storm of inefficiency, and I was uniquely positioned to address it. I had the business experience to understand what companies really needed. I had the network to connect with decision-makers. I had the credibility to be taken seriously by both employers and job seekers. And now, thanks to my own experience with age discrimination, I had the motivation to create something better. But most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. The business plan that emerged over the following weeks was unlike anything I had ever created. Instead of a traditional consulting firm, I envisioned a hybrid organization that combined executive recruiting, business consulting, and workforce development. We would work with companies to identify their real staffing needs, not just the job descriptions they post. We would help them understand the value of experience and the hidden costs of high turnover, and then we would connect them with a curated network of experienced professionals who had been pushed out of traditional employment but weren't ready to retire. But here's where it got interesting. Instead of just placing people in existing jobs, we would help companies create new positions that leveraged the unique strengths of experienced workers. Part-time consulting roles, project-based positions, mentorship program, flexible arrangements that recognized that a 70-year-old might not want to work 60 hours a week, but could bring 40 years of expertise to solving complex problems. I called it Renaissance Professional Services, and the tagline I scribbled at the bottom of my business plan made me smile: where experience meets opportunity. The first person I called was Clara. She had been job hunting since the acquisition, finding the market just as challenging as I had. When I explained my idea, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Mitchell," she finally said, "that's either completely crazy or absolutely brilliant." "It might be both," I admitted. "Are you interested in being crazy with me?" She didn't hesitate. "When do we start?" The second call was harder. I needed startup capital, and that meant swallowing my pride and asking for help. I called my former assistant treasurer at Apex, Robert Chen, who had left the company 6 months before the acquisition to start his own financial consulting practice. "Joe," Robert sounded surprised to hear from me. "I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry. Marcus really screwed you over." I gave him the abbreviated version of my plan. Robert was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Joe, you're talking about starting a business at 75. That's ambitious." "Robert, I've been thinking about this wrong. Everyone keeps talking about my age like it's a liability, but what if it's actually an asset? What if the fact that I'm 75 is exactly why this business will work?" "How do you figure?" "Because I understand both sides of the equation. I know what it feels like to be discarded by a system that values youth over experience. But I also know what companies really need. And it's not just younger workers, it's reliable, experienced, problem-solving workers who understand that a job is more than just a paycheck." Robert was quiet again. "How much are you looking for?" $200,000 to start, enough to cover operating expenses for the first year while we build the network and prove the concept. "I'll need to see a full business plan. I'll have it to you by Friday." That Friday, I walked into Robert's office with a 40-page business plan, complete with market analysis, financial projections, and a detailed explanation of how Renaissance Professional Services would fill a gap that no one else was addressing. Robert read it while I waited, occasionally looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When he finished, he set the plan down and leaned back in his chair. "Joe, this is good. Really good. But I have to ask, are you sure you want to start over at 70? You could retire comfortably. You could travel, spend time with family, enjoy your golden years." I thought about that for a moment. The truth was, I probably could retire comfortably. I had savings, investments, and a pension from Apex that would keep me secure for the rest of my life. I could buy a condo in Florida, take up watercolor painting, and fade gracefully into irrelevance. "Robert," I said finally, "I've never been golden years material. And besides, this isn't about starting over. This is about finishing what I started when I was 52 and thought I was too old to begin." He smiled and pulled out his checkbook. "In that case, consider me your first investor." Renaissance Professional Services officially opened 6 months after I walked out of the Meridian Tower with my cardboard box. We started small, Clara and me working out of my home office, building a database of experienced professionals who had been pushed out of traditional employment. Our first client was a mid-sized manufacturing company in Milwaukee that was struggling with quality control issues. Their young workforce was technically skilled but lacked the experience to spot problems before they became expensive mistakes. We connected them with Harold Peterson, a 68-year-old former quality control manager who had been laid off during a restructuring at his previous company. Harold worked part-time, 3 days a week, providing oversight and training to the younger quality control staff. Within 6 months, the company's defect rate had dropped by 40%, and they were saving enough money to easily justify Harold's consulting fee. Word spread quickly in the manufacturing community. By the end of our first year, Renaissance Professional Services had placed 37 experienced professionals in consulting and part-time positions across the Midwest. But the real breakthrough came when we started thinking big. Instead of just placing individuals, we began developing comprehensive workforce solutions for companies that were struggling with knowledge transfer and succession planning. We created mentorship programs that paired experienced workers with younger employees. We designed project-based consulting arrangements that allowed companies to access decades of expertise without the overhead of full-time employment. Most importantly, we started changing the conversation about age in the workplace. Instead of talking about older workers as a burden or a liability, we positioned them as a strategic advantage. We helped companies understand that while a 30-year-old might have more energy, a 60-year-old had more wisdom. While a recent graduate might know the latest software, an experienced professional knew how to manage clients, solve complex problems, and avoid expensive mistakes. We weren't just placing people in jobs, we were creating a new model for how work could function in an aging society. By our second year, Renaissance Professional Services had grown to 12 full-time employees and a network of over 300 experienced professionals. We had clients in 17 states and had generated over $2 million in revenue. But the real measure of our success wasn't in the numbers, it was in the stories. Like Margaret Sullivan, a former bank vice president, who had been pushed into early retirement at 62 and thought her career was over. We connected her with a chain of credit unions that needed help modernizing their lending practices. Margaret worked part-time for 3 different credit unions, sharing her expertise while maintaining the flexible schedule she wanted. Or David Kim, a 65-year-old engineer who had been laid off when his company moved manufacturing overseas. We found him a consulting role with a startup that needed someone who understood both the technical and practical aspects of product development. David's experience helped them avoid costly design mistakes that could have killed the company before it got off the ground. These weren't charity cases or sympathy hires. These were strategic business decisions that created value for everyone involved. The companies got access to expertise they couldn't afford to hire full-time. The experienced professionals got meaningful work that respected their knowledge and accommodated their life circumstance, and the younger workers got mentorship and training that would benefit them throughout their careers. We had created a marketplace where experience was valued instead of discarded, where age was an asset instead of a liability, and where the concept of unemployable became obsolete. Standing in my office 3 years after that humiliating meeting with Tommy Rodriguez, I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline and smiled. Renaissance Professional Services now occupied 2 floors of a building just 6 blocks from the Meridian Tower where I had been escorted out by security guards. We employed 47 full-time staff members and had facilitated work arrangements for over 800 experienced professionals. Our clients ranged from small family businesses to Fortune 500 companies that had discovered the competitive advantage of intergenerational workforces. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Marcus Webb called. Consolidated Dynamics had acquired several other companies after Apex Solutions, and they were struggling with integration issues. Their young tech-savvy leadership was great at identifying problems, but struggled with implementation and change management. "Joe," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral, "I know this might be awkward, but we could really use your expertise on a project." I let the silence stretch for a moment, remembering the last time we had spoken in that corporate office with security guards hovering nearby. "Marcus, I'd be happy to help. Renaissance Professional Services specializes in exactly the kind of consulting work you're describing. Clara can send you our standard consulting agreement and rate structure." "Joe, I was hoping we could work something out personally, given our history." "Our history is exactly why this needs to go through proper channels," I said, but I'm confident we can provide the expertise you need." When we hung up, Clara looked at me with a grin. "How much are we charging them?" "Our premium rate," I said, "plus a surcharge for companies that don't value experience until they desperately need it." The contract with Consolidated Dynamics was worth $400,000 over 6 months. They were essentially paying me more in half a year than they had been willing to pay me as a full-time CEO. And I was working on my own terms, with my own team, solving problems that leveraged every bit of experience I had accumulated over 5 decades in business. More importantly, the success of that project led to 3 more contracts with similar companies, each one validating the business model we had built and the value proposition we represent. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same companies that were pushing experienced workers out the front door were paying premium consulting fees to bring that same experience back through the side door. But that was exactly the market inefficiency we had built our business to address. As I write this, Renaissance Professional Services is approaching its 5th anniversary. We now operate in 32 states with a network of over 2,000 experienced professionals. Last year, we facilitated work arrangements that generated more than $18 million in income for people who had been told they were unemployable. We've been featured in Harvard Business Review as an example of innovative workforce solutions. We've consulted with government agencies on age discrimination policies. We've spoken at conferences about the future of work in an aging society. But the moment that meant the most to me came just last month, when a woman named Patricia Anderson walked into our office. Patricia was 71, had been a marketing director at a major retailer for 25 years, and had been laid off in a digital transformation initiative that replaced her entire department with younger workers and automated systems. She sat across from me, in the same plastic chair where I had once felt worthless and unemployable, and she said the words I had heard dozens of times before. "They told me I'm too old, that I don't understand social media and digital marketing. They said I should consider retirement." I looked at this accomplished, intelligent woman who had successfully marketed products to multiple generations for decades, and I saw myself 5 years earlier. But this time I had a different response. "Patricia," I said, "has anyone ever told you that the most successful marketing campaigns combine digital innovation with strategic thinking? That while algorithms can target demographics, it takes human experience to understand what actually motivates people to buy?" Her eyes lit up. "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell them." "Well, I have 3 clients right now who are struggling with exactly that problem. They've got all the digital tools they could want, but they can't figure out why their conversion rates are so low. Would you be interested in some consulting work while we find you the right permanent arrangement?" 6 weeks later, Patricia's consulting work had turned into a permanent part-time position with a growing e-commerce company that discovered they needed someone who understood both digital marketing and human psychology. That's what we do at Renaissance Professional Service. We don't just find jobs for people, we help companies understand that in a world obsessed with artificial intelligence and automation, human intelligence and experience are more valuable than ever. The young caseworker who told me I was unemployable wasn't wrong about the traditional job market, but he was thinking too small. He was looking at a world where 75-year-olds compete with 25-year-olds for the same entry-level positions, and in that world, ageism wins every time. We created a different world, where experience competes with innovation, where wisdom combines with energy, and where the accumulated knowledge of decades becomes a strategic advantage instead of a liability. Today, Renaissance Professional Services employs over 500 people directly and has facilitated work for thousands more. We've proven that unemployable is just another word for undervalued by people who don't understand value. Most importantly, we've shown that sometimes the best response to being thrown away is to build something so successful that the people who discarded you end up paying premium prices to get back what they lost. The unemployment office still buzzes with fluorescent lights and hums with quiet desperation. But now, instead of being a place where dreams go to die, it's one of our most productive recruiting locations. Because we've learned that other people's discards often contain hidden treasure, and sometimes the best business opportunities are hiding in plain sight, in the places where society deposits its supposedly worthless people. I'm 79 now, and according to conventional wisdom, I should be even more unemployable than I was at 75. But last month we opened our 15th regional office, and next quarter we're expanding into Canada. The world told me I was finished. I decided to show them I was just getting started, and that, as it turns out, made all the difference. The weeks following my encounter with Tommy Rodriguez felt like living in a strange alternate reality where everyone around me continued their normal routines, while I floated through days that had lost their structure and purpose. For 47 years, I had woken up with somewhere to go, something to accomplish, people depending on me to make decisions that mattered. Now I woke up to silence and empty hours that stretched ahead like unmarked territory. My house had never felt so large or so quiet. I found myself wandering from room to room, straightening things that were already straight, organizing closets that didn't need organizing, cooking elaborate meals for one person who wasn't particularly hungry. The morning news became my companion, though I found myself paying attention to business segments with a mixture of nostalgia and bitter amusement. Young analysts discussed market trends and corporate strategies with the confidence of people who had never had their life's work dismissed as obsolete. Clara called every few days, updating me on her job search, and sharing gossip from our former colleagues at Apex Solutions. The company was struggling under consolidated dynamics management, she reported. Several key clients had already terminated their contracts, frustrated by the impersonal approach of the new leadership team. Marcus was implementing cost-cutting measures that were affecting service quality, and employee morale was at an all-time low. Miss Mitchell, Clara said during one of our conversations, I keep thinking about all those people who are going to lose their jobs, because these idiots don't understand what made Apex special. It makes me so angry. I understood her anger, but I found myself surprisingly calm about the situation. There was something almost poetic about watching a company built on relationships and personal service crumble under the weight of corporate efficiency. It confirmed what I had always believed, that business was ultimately about people, not spreadsheets, and that sustainable success came from understanding human nature, not just market dynamics. But the calm I felt about Apex's struggles didn't extend to my own situation. I was trapped in a liminal space between my old life and whatever came next, and the uncertainty was more uncomfortable than I had anticipated. The first crack in my composure came during a routine trip to the grocery store. I was standing in the checkout line behind a woman about my age, who was clearly struggling to stretch her budget across a cart full of generic brands and marked-down produce. When her debit card was declined, I watched her face cycle through embarrassment, frustration and resignation as she began removing items from her order. Without thinking, I stepped forward and handed my card to the cashier. I'll cover it, I said quietly. The woman turned to look at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I can't let you do that. I don't even know you. My name is Joe, I said, and yes, you can let me do this. We've all been where you are. As we walked to the parking lot together, she told me her story. Margaret was 73, had worked as an administrative assistant for 35 years at a law firm that had laid her off 6 months earlier during a technology upgrade. Her unemployment benefits had run out, her savings were depleted, and she was facing the possibility of losing her apartment. I never thought I'd be one of those people, she said, her voice hollow. I always worked, always paid my bills, always thought if you did the right things, you'd be okay, but nobody wants to hire someone my age, and the jobs that are available don't pay enough to live on. I listened to Margaret's story with a growing sense of recognition. She wasn't just describing her own experience, she was describing the experience of millions of people who had been pushed out of the workforce and left to navigate an economic system that had no place for them. That night, I lay awake thinking about Margaret and all the other Margarets scattered across the country, experienced, capable people who had been discarded, not because they lacked skills or work ethic, but because they had the misfortune of aging in a culture that equated youth with value. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my own situation, while personally devastating, was part of a much larger problem. I wasn't just an individual who had been treated unfairly, I was a data point in a massive system failure that was wasting human resources on an unprecedented scale. This realization sparked something in me that had been dormant since my termination. For the first time in weeks, I felt the familiar stirring of analytical thinking, the mental process that had made me successful as a business consultant. I began to see patterns where others saw isolated incidents, systems where others saw random events. I started researching in earnest, spending hours online learning about employment trends, age discrimination statistics, and demographic shifts in the workforce. What I discovered was both shocking and illuminating. The United States was experiencing the most dramatic demographic shift in its history. Baby boomers, the largest generation ever, were approaching traditional retirement age, but many were neither financially prepared nor emotionally ready to stop working. Simultaneously, birth rates had been declining for decades, meaning there weren't enough younger workers to replace the experience and institutional knowledge that older workers possess. Yet instead of recognizing this demographic reality and adapting accordingly, most employers were accelerating their efforts to push older workers out of the workforce. Companies were conducting layoffs that disproportionately affected workers over 50, implementing hiring practices that favored younger candidates, and creating workplace cultures that made older employees feel unwelcome and undervalued. The economic implications were staggering. According to research from AARP, age discrimination was costing the U.S. economy over $850 billion annually in lost productivity, reduced consumer spending, and increased social services costs. Companies were essentially throwing away billions of dollars worth of experience and expertise, while simultaneously complaining about skills shortages and high turnover rates, but the human cost was even more devastating. I read story after story of people like Margaret, capable, experienced workers who had been pushed into poverty not because they couldn't do the work, but because society had decided they were no longer worth employing. As I delved deeper into the research, I began to understand that age discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was economically irrational. Study after study showed that older workers were more reliable, had better customer service skills, and were more loyal to their employers than younger workers. They had lower absenteeism rates, fewer workplace accidents, and were less likely to job hop for marginal salary increase. Yet these facts were being ignored, in favor of stereotypes and assumptions about older workers being inflexible, technologically incompetent, or expensive to employ. The disconnect was so obvious and so massive that I couldn't understand why more people weren't talking about it. Then I realized the answer. The people who made hiring decisions were mostly young or middle-aged professionals who saw older workers as competition or obstacles rather than resources. And the people who were being discriminated against were too busy trying to survive to organize effective resistance. This insight led me to a larger understanding about how discrimination worked in general. It wasn't usually the result of conscious malice, it was the result of unconscious bias combined with institutional structures that made unfairness seem natural and inevitable. Companies didn't set out to discriminate against older workers. They simply created hiring processes that favored young candidates, workplace cultures that celebrated youth and innovation over experience and wisdom, and compensation structures that made older workers seem expensive compared to their younger counterparts. The discrimination was systemic, embedded in the very foundations of how modern business operated, and like all systemic problems, it couldn't be solved by individual action alone. It required a fundamental rethinking of how we organized work, valued experience, and structured employment relationships. This realization was simultaneously depressing and energizing. Depressing because it meant the problem was much bigger and more entrenched than I had initially understood. Energizing because big, systemic problems created opportunities for big, systemic solutions. As a business consultant, I had spent decades identifying inefficiencies and developing strategies to address them. Now I was looking at the biggest inefficiency I had ever encountered, an entire economic system that was systematically wasting one of its most valuable resources. My daily routine began to change as I immersed myself in this research. Instead of wandering aimlessly through my house, I spent hours at my computer, reading academic studies, government reports, and news articles about aging and employment. I started a spreadsheet tracking demographic trends, employment statistics,
and economic indicators. I began taking notes in the same systematic way I had approached client problems during my consulting career. For the first time since my termination, I felt like I was working again, not for a paycheck or a title, but for understanding. I was trying to comprehend a problem that affected millions of people and cost the economy billions of dollars, and I was approaching it with the same analytical rigor I had brought to every business challenge I had ever faced. The breakthrough came when I shifted my focus from the problem to the opportunities it created.
If companies were systematically undervaluing older workers, that created arbitrage opportunities for competitors who understood their true worth. If the traditional employment system was failing to match experienced workers with suitable positions, that created market space for alternative approaches. If society was wasting billions of dollars worth of human capital, that represented massive potential value for anyone who could figure out how to capture and deploy it effectively. I began to think about older workers not as a problem to be managed, but as an untapped resource waiting to be discovered. What if instead of trying to fit experienced professionals into traditional employment structures that weren't designed for them, we created new structures that leveraged their unique strengths? What if instead of seeing age as a liability, we positioned it as a competitive advantage? What if instead of accepting the conventional wisdom about older workers being expensive and inflexible, we demonstrated that they could be cost-effective and adaptable when placed in appropriate roles? These questions led me to start thinking about business models and market opportunities. As someone who had spent decades helping companies solve problems, I couldn't help but see the massive disconnect between what employers needed and what they thought they wanted. Small and medium-sized businesses, in particular, were struggling with challenges that experienced professionals were uniquely qualified to address. They needed strategic guidance, but couldn't afford high-end consulting firms. They needed experienced managers, but couldn't justify full-time executive salaries. They needed institutional knowledge and relationship-building skills, but they were hiring based on technical credentials and cultural fit with younger employees. Meanwhile, there were millions of experienced professionals who had been pushed out of traditional employment, but weren't ready to retire. They had decades of knowledge and expertise that they were eager to share, but no platform for doing so. They wanted to continue working, but on terms that recognized their experience and accommodated their life circumstances. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just an employment problem, it was a market failure. There was massive demand on both sides, but no efficient mechanism for connecting supply with demand. Traditional employment agencies focused on placing people in existing jobs rather than creating new opportunities. Executive search firms worked only with high-level positions and full-time placements. Career services for older workers were mostly focused on helping them compete for traditional jobs, rather than leveraging their unique value proposition. What was missing was an organization that understood both the real needs of businesses and the actual capabilities of experienced workers. Something that could translate between the language of employers and the reality of older job seekers. Something that could create value by bridging the gap between perception and potential. As I developed these ideas, I found myself getting excited about possibilities rather than dwelling on past injustice. The analytical part of my brain was fully engaged again, and I was beginning to see the outlines of something that could be much bigger than just a solution to my own employment problems. I started making lists of potential business models, revenue streams, and target market. I researched competitors and analogous businesses in other industries. I began to sketch out what a new kind of employment service might look like. One that was designed specifically for experienced professionals and the companies that needed their expertise. But the more I worked on these ideas, the more I realized that I needed to test my assumptions with real data. I had developed a theory about unmet demand and untapped supply, but I needed to validate it with actual employers and job seekers. I decided to start conducting informal interviews with business owners and experienced professionals to better understand their perspectives and needs. This wasn't yet a business plan, it was market research driven by curiosity and the need to understand whether my insights matched reality. My first interview was with Robert Chen, my former colleague from Apex Solutions who had started his own financial consulting practice. I called him under the pretense of catching up, but quickly steered the conversation toward his experience as a business owner. Robert, you've been running your own practice for a few years now. What's been your biggest challenge in terms of staffing and capacity? He laughed. That's easy. I need experienced help, but I can't afford to hire full-time professionals at the rates they expect. I end up doing everything myself or hiring young people who need extensive training. It's feast or famine. Either I'm overwhelmed with work or I don't have enough to justify permanent staff. What if you could access experienced professionals on a project basis? People who could hit the ground running without extensive training. That would be ideal, he said immediately, but where would I find people like that, and how would I know they're reliable? His response confirmed what I had suspected. Small business owners needed exactly what experienced professionals could provide, but they didn't know how to connect with each other. My next conversation was with Sandra Williams, a former colleague who had been laid off from Apex Solutions 2 months before the acquisition. She was 62 and had been struggling to find new employment, despite 30 years of experience in business development. Sandra, what's been the biggest frustration in your job search? Everything, she said with a bitter laugh. The online applications that screen me out before any human sees my resume, the interviews where I can tell they've already decided I'm too old, the job descriptions that ask for 5 years of experience but only want to pay entry-level wages. It's like they want the benefits of experience without being willing to pay for it. What would your ideal work situation look like at this stage of your career? She thought for a moment. I'd love to work part-time or on a project basis. I don't need full-time employment or traditional benefits. My husband and I have health insurance through his job, but I want to do meaningful work that uses my experience. I want to feel like I'm contributing something valuable, not just filling a seat. Again, Sandra's response confirmed my hypothesis. There were experienced professionals who wanted to work, but on different terms than traditional full-time employment offer. Over the following weeks, I conducted similar conversations with a dozen other people, business owners, laid-off professionals, HR managers, and career counselors. The pattern was consistent across all my interviews. Employers needed experienced help, but couldn't justify full-time hires or weren't sure how to access qualified candidates. Experienced professionals wanted to continue working but were frustrated by a job market that didn't recognize their value or accommodate their preferences for flexible arrangements. Most tellingly, both sides were making assumptions about the other that weren't necessarily true. Employers assumed older workers were expensive, inflexible, and technologically incompetent. Older job seekers assumed employers only wanted young, cheap labor and weren't interested in experience. But when I dug deeper, I found that many employers would happily pay premium rates for genuinely experienced help, and many older workers were willing to accept lower total compensation in exchange for flexibility, meaningful work, and respect for their expertise. The problem wasn't irreconcilable differences. It was communication and coordination failures. Neither side understood what the other actually needed or wanted, and there was no effective mechanism for facilitating productive connection. This insight led me to a crucial realization. The opportunity wasn't just in placing older workers in existing jobs. The real opportunity was in creating new models of work that leveraged the specific strengths of experienced professionals while meeting the actual needs of modern business. Instead of trying to make 60-year-olds compete with 25-year-olds for the same positions, what if we created roles that were specifically designed for people with decades of experience? Instead of forcing experienced professionals into full-time employment structures that might not suit their life circumstances, what if we developed flexible arrangements that recognized their value while accommodating their preferences? Instead of treating age as a liability to be overcome, what if we positioned experience as a premium service that commanded premium prices? These questions led me to start thinking seriously about starting a business, not because I needed the money or wanted to prove a point to my former colleagues, but because I had identified a massive market opportunity that no one else seemed to be addressing effectively. The more I researched and analyzed, the more convinced I became that there was space for a new kind of organization. One that specialized in connecting experienced professionals with businesses that needed their expertise, but on terms that worked for both parties. It wouldn't be a traditional employment agency or executive search firm. It would be something closer to a consulting marketplace, where businesses could access high-level expertise on a project basis, and experienced professionals could continue contributing their knowledge without the constraints of traditional employment. But before I could move forward with any kind of business plan, I needed to understand one more thing: whether I had the energy and motivation to start over at 75. Starting a business at any age is challenging, risky, and demanding. Starting one at 75, after being told by society that I was unemployable, would require not just business acumen, but also emotional resilience and physical stamina that I wasn't sure I still possessed. I had spent the last few months feeling adrift and purposeless. Could I summon the focus and determination needed to build something new? Did I have the credibility to convince investors, clients, and employees to take a chance on a 75-year-old entrepreneur? Was I prepared for the possibility of failure, which would confirm everyone's assumptions about my obsolescence? These were the questions that kept me awake at night as my research phase transitioned into decision time. I had identified an opportunity, validated the market need, and developed the outlines of a solution. Now I had to decide whether I was prepared to bet everything on the belief that experience was still valuable in a world that seemed determined to discard it. The answer came to me during another conversation with Margaret, the woman I had met in the grocery store. She had called to thank me again for my help and to update me on her continued job search struggle. "Joe," she said, "I've been thinking about what you said that day about all of us being in the same situation. I've started talking to other people my age, and you're right, there are so many of us who just want to work, who have so much to offer. But nobody seems to want what we have. What would you do if someone created opportunities specifically for people like us?" I asked. "I'd jump at the chance," she said immediately. "Even if it wasn't traditional employment, even if it was part-time or project work. Just to feel useful again, to feel like my experience mattered. That would be worth more than any salary." That conversation crystallized everything for me. This wasn't just about business opportunities or market inefficiencies. It was about human dignity and the waste of human potential on a massive scale. I thought about all the Margarets scattered across the country. Competent, experienced, motivated people who had been discarded by an economic system that measured value in all the wrong way. I thought about all the small business owners struggling with challenges that these experienced professionals could easily solve, if only there was a way to connect them. And I thought about my own situation. 75 years old, financially secure enough to take risks, with decades of business experience and nothing left to prove to anyone. If not me, then who? If not now, then when? The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitability. I was going to start a business, not because I needed to, but because I could, because I had identified a problem that needed solving, and I had the skills, experience, and motivation to solve it. Because someone had to show the world that unemployable was just another word for undervalued by people who don't understand value. The night I made that decision, I called Clara to share my plan. She listened quietly as I outlined my research, my insights, and my growing conviction that we could build something significant. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said when I finished, "I have one question. When do we start?" For the first time in months, I fell asleep easily that night. I had found my purpose again, and it felt like coming home. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning, when I was reviewing my financial statements, and realized I had something most 75-year-olds didn't: enough money to fail spectacularly and still eat well. The pension from Apex, combined with my investment portfolio and savings, meant I could afford to take risks that would be impossible for someone depending on immediate income. This wasn't just freedom, it was a superpower I hadn't recognized until that moment. I sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets scattered across the surface, calculating how much capital I could afford to invest in this venture without compromising my long-term security. The numbers were encouraging. I could fund a startup for at least 2 years without touching my retirement accounts, and if the business failed completely, I would still be financially comfortable for the rest of my life. But more importantly,
I realized that my age gave me credibility with exactly the demographic I wanted to serve. A 30-year-old entrepreneur talking about the value of experienced workers would sound patronizing. A 75-year-old who had built and lost a company, who had been personally victimized by age discrimination, who understood both the challenges and the opportunities from the inside out, that was authentic in a way that couldn't be manufactured. My phone rang while I was lost in these calculations. It was David Rosenberg, a former client from my Apex days, who now ran a mid-sized logistics company in Milwaukee. We hadn't spoken since the acquisition, but he had somehow heard about my situation. "Joe, I had to call when I heard what happened to you. That whole situation with Consolidated Dynamics is just criminal. You built something special at Apex, and they threw it away for some corporate efficiency bullshit." I appreciated his loyalty, but I was more interested in his perspective as a business owner. "David, let me ask you something. What's your biggest operational challenge right now?" He laughed. "That's a loaded question. Where do I'm growing fast, but I can't find experienced managers who understand logistics and can handle the complexity of our operation. I've hired 3 operations managers in the past 2 years, and they're all smart kids with good credentials, but they don't have the instincts you need in this business. They make expensive mistakes because they haven't seen all the ways things can go wrong. What would it be worth to you to have access to someone with 20 or 30 years of logistics experience? Someone who could come in and solve specific problems or mentor your younger managers? Are you offering?" he asked hopefully. "I'm exploring something," I said carefully. "But let's say theoretically I could connect you with a former logistics executive who was looking for project work or part-time consulting. Someone who could provide the experience your team needs without the overhead of a full-time executive salary." David was quiet for a moment. "Joe, if you could do that, you'd be solving one of my biggest problems. I'd pay consultant rates for someone who really knew what they were doing. Hell, I'd probably pay more than I'm paying my current people, because they'd actually add value instead of creating problems I have to fix." After we hung up, I made similar calls to 5 other former clients. The responses were remarkably consistent. They all needed experienced help. They were all frustrated with the quality of available candidates, and they were all willing to pay premium rates for genuine expertise, especially if it came without the complications of traditional full-time employment. But the conversation that really opened my eyes came when I called Jennifer Walsh, who owned a chain of boutique hotels in tourist areas across Michigan. Jennifer was about 50, sharp as a knife, and known for running tight operations with exceptional customer service. "Joe, I've been thinking about calling you since I heard what happened. I have a proposition that might interest you." She explained that she was expanding into Wisconsin and Minnesota, but she needed someone with strategic experience to help her navigate the regulatory environment and establish relationships with local vendors and tourism boards. She couldn't justify hiring a full-time executive for what might be an 18-month project, but she needed someone with serious credentials who could represent her company in high-level negotiation. "I need someone who can walk into a room full of government officials and business leaders and immediately command respect," she said. "Someone who's been there before and knows how these relationships work. I'm willing to pay handsomely for that kind of expertise, but I need it to be flexible." "What kind of arrangement were you thinking?" I asked. "Part-time commitment, maybe 2 days a week during the initial phase, then on-call as needed for meetings and negotiation. I'd pay consultant rates, probably more than I pay my regular managers, but I'd get exactly the expertise I need when I need it." Jennifer's offer was intriguing, but more importantly, it illustrated the exact market opportunity I had been thinking about. She needed high-level strategic expertise, but not a full-time executive. She was willing to pay premium rates for the right person, but she needed flexibility that traditional employment couldn't provide. After that call, I spent the afternoon making a list of all the experienced professionals I knew who had been pushed out of traditional employment. The names filled 3 pages: former executives, senior managers, technical specialists, and industry experts who had been forced into retirement or laid off during corporate restructuring. I started calling them, not with job offers, but with questions about their experience and what they might be looking for in terms of future work. The conversations were illuminating and often heartbreaking. Patricia Hodges had been the vice president of human resources at a manufacturing company for 18 years, before being laid off in a merger. At 67, she had given up looking for traditional employment, but she was still sharp, experienced, and eager to contribute her expertise somehow. "Joe, I spent 30 years learning how to build effective teams, manage difficult employees, and navigate complex workplace issues. I know how to prevent the kinds of problems that cost companies millions of dollars. But apparently, all that knowledge is worthless, because I'm too old to be taken seriously." Frank Morrison had been a quality control director at a food processing company until automation and cost-cutting eliminated his position. At 71, he had decades of experience in food safety, regulatory compliance, and process improvement, but no prospects for using that knowledge productively. "The young engineers they're hiring now are brilliant with the technology," he told me, "but they don't understand the practical aspects of running a food plant. They design systems that look perfect on paper but fall apart when you try to implement them in the real world. They're making mistakes that I could help them avoid, but nobody wants to listen to the old guy." Carol Peterson had built and sold 2 successful marketing agencies, before taking a corporate position that ended when the company relocated operations overseas. At 65, she had more marketing expertise than most agencies could afford to hire, but she was being told she didn't understand digital marketing or social media. "It's ridiculous," she said with frustration. "Yes, I need to learn new platforms and technologies, but marketing is fundamentally about understanding human psychology and building relationships. Those skills don't expire when you turn 60. If anything, they get better with experience." As I listened to these stories, I began to see the full scope of the waste happening across the economy. These weren't people who were washed up or incompetent, they were highly skilled professionals, who had been discarded by a system that confused technological change with human obsolescence. But I also began to see how their stories could be reframed. Instead of focusing on what they had lost, what if we focused on what they had gained? Instead of treating their age as a liability, what if we positioned their experience as a premium service? Patricia didn't just know human resources, she knew how to prevent the kind of workplace disasters that destroy companies. Frank didn't just understand quality control, he knew how to implement systems that actually worked in practice. Carol didn't just know marketing, she understood how to build authentic relationships with customers across multiple generations. These weren't consolation prizes or charity cases. These were strategic advantages that could command premium prices in the right market. That realization led me to start thinking about branding and positioning. If I was going to create a business around connecting experienced professionals with companies that needed their expertise, I had to find a way to communicate value rather than desperation. The traditional employment model positioned older workers as damaged goods, seeking sympathy. Job seekers over 50 were taught to hide their age, minimize their experience, and compete on the same terms as much younger candidates. The message was essentially, please ignore my obvious disadvantages and give me a chance anyway. But what if we flipped that narrative completely? What if instead of apologizing for experience we celebrated? What if instead of competing with 25-year-olds for entry-level positions, we created premium positions that only experienced professionals could fill? What if we stopped trying to hide age and started marketing it as a luxury service? This perspective shift changed everything about how I thought about the business model. Instead of an employment agency for older workers, I began envisioning a strategic consulting firm that specialized in providing high-level expertise through experienced professionals. Instead of placing people in jobs, we would be providing solutions to business problems. Instead of asking companies to take a chance on older workers, we would be offering them access to expertise they couldn't afford to hire full-time. Instead of competing on price, we would be competing on value. I spent the next week developing this concept, thinking through the implications for pricing, service delivery, and client acquisition. The more I worked on it, the more excited I became about the possibility. Traditional consulting firms were expensive and often impersonal. They sent young MBAs with impressive credentials, but limited real-world experience to solve problems that required deep industry knowledge and practical wisdom. Clients paid premium prices for theoretical solutions that often failed in implementation. But what if we could offer something different? What if we could provide consulting services delivered by people who had actually run businesses, managed complex operations, and solved similar problems before? What if clients could get strategic advice from professionals who had decades of experience in their specific industry? The value proposition was compelling: better expertise at competitive prices, delivered by professionals who understood both the theoretical and practical aspects of business challenges.
But the real breakthrough came when I realized that this model could benefit experienced professionals just as much as it benefited clients. Instead of forcing them to accept positions that underutilized their skills and experience, we could create opportunities that leveraged their expertise and commanded respect. Instead of asking them to compete with younger workers for traditional jobs, we could position them as premium service providers whose experience justified higher compensation. Instead of making them feel like they were asking for charity, we could make them feel like they were providing value that clients were eager to pay for. This shift in perspective was transformative for me personally. Instead of seeing myself as a displaced 75-year-old looking for employment, I began to see myself as an experienced entrepreneur with a unique market insight and the resources to act on it. I called Clara that evening to share my evolving thoughts about the business concept. She listened carefully as I explained the positioning strategy and the potential market opportunity. "Mrs. Mitchell, this sounds like more than just a business. This sounds like you're trying to change how society thinks about age and work." "Maybe I am," I admitted, "but I'm trying to do it in a way that creates value for everyone involved. The best social change happens when it's also good business." Clara was quiet for a moment. What would this look like in practice? How would we actually deliver these services? I had been thinking about operational models, and I had some ideas. We'd start by building a network of experienced professionals in different fields. We'd screen them carefully, not just for technical skills, but for communication ability, professionalism, and the kind of wisdom that only comes with experience. Then we'd work with companies to identify their real needs, not just the job descriptions they post. We'd help them understand how experienced professionals could solve problems they might not even realize they have. And instead of traditional placement fees, we'd work more like a consulting firm. We'd charge clients for results, and we'd pay our professionals consultant rates rather than employee wages. Clara was getting excited. So the professionals would be independent contractors working on specific projects? Exactly. They'd have the flexibility to choose their assignments, work part-time if they wanted, and focus on the type of work they find most meaningful. And clients would get access to expertise they couldn't afford to hire full-time. What would you call this company? I had been thinking about names, and I had settled on something that captured both the dignity of experience and the value proposition for clients. Renaissance Professional Services. The idea is that experienced professionals are having a renaissance, a rebirth of their careers in a new form that better utilizes their abilities. Clara loved the name, and we spent the rest of the evening brainstorming about everything from marketing strategies to fee structure. By the time she left, I felt like I had a business partner, not just a potential employee. But I still needed to validate the concept with potential investors and advisors. I couldn't bootstrap a consulting firm the way I had started Apex Solutions 20 years earlier. This business would require credibility, marketing, and operational infrastructure that would cost significant money upfront. My first call was to Robert Chen, my former financial manager who had offered to look at a business plan. But before I wrote a formal plan, I wanted to test my thinking with someone who understood both my background and the current business environment. "Robert, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to run something by you. What if instead of starting a traditional employment agency, I created a strategic consulting firm that specialized in providing high-level expertise through experienced professionals?" I explained the concept, the market research I had conducted, and the positioning strategy I had developed. Robert listened without interrupting, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated he was thinking seriously about the business model. Joe, this is interesting. You're essentially creating a new category of professional services, but I have some concerns about execution. How do you maintain quality control when you're working with independent contractors? How do you manage client relationships when you're not directly supervising the work? How do you scale this kind of personalized service? These were excellent questions that I hadn't fully considered. Robert's concerns forced me to think more deeply about operational challenges and risk management. You're right that this would be more complex than traditional consulting or placement services, I admitted, but I think the market opportunity justifies the complexity, and my experience managing consulting teams at Apex should help me develop appropriate systems and processes. What kind of startup capital are you thinking about? I had done some preliminary calculations based on my research into similar business. I think I'd need at least $300,000 to launch properly, enough to cover office space, marketing, technology systems, and operating expenses. For the first year while we build the client base, Robert was quiet for a long moment. Joe, I like the concept, and I think you're uniquely qualified to execute it, but I want to see a detailed business plan before I commit to anything. This is the kind of business that could be very successful or could fail quickly if the execution isn't perfect. I understand. Give me 6 weeks to put together a comprehensive plan, and then we can talk seriously about investment. After that conversation, I realized I needed to approach the business planning process more systematically. This wasn't going to be a simple consulting practice that I could start from my kitchen table. It was going to be a complex operation that required careful planning, significant investment, and professional execution. I decided to treat the business plan development like a consulting project, using the same analytical methods I had applied to client challenges during my career at Apex. I would research the market thoroughly, analyze the competition, develop detailed financial projections, and create operational plans that addressed every aspect of service delivery. But first, I needed to validate my assumptions about client demand with more formal research. I designed a survey for small and medium-sized business owners, asking about their staffing challenges, their experience with consultants, and their interest in accessing experienced professionals on a project basis. I also created a survey for experienced professionals, asking about their employment situation, their interest in flexible work arrangements, and their willingness to work as independent contractors rather than traditional employees. Getting responses to these surveys required me to tap into networks I hadn't used in months. I reached out to former clients, professional associations, and business organizations I had been involved with during my career. I explained that I was conducting research for a potential new business and asked for their help in understanding market needs. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Business owners were eager to share their frustrations with current staffing options, and experienced professionals were enthusiastic about alternatives to traditional job searches. The survey results confirmed everything I had suspected and more. 87% of business owners reported difficulty finding experienced talent for key positions. 73% said they would be interested in accessing high-level expertise on a project basis if the quality was guaranteed and the cost was reasonable. 92% of experienced professionals said they would consider flexible work arrangements that utilized their expertise. 86% said they would be willing to work as independent contractors if the compensation was fair and the work was meaningful. But the most telling statistic was that 64% of business owners and 78% of experienced professionals said they had never been contacted by any organization offering the kind of services I was proposing. The market gap was real, significant, and largely unaddressed by existing businesses. Armed with this data, I began writing a formal business plan. I approached it the same way I had approached major consulting proposals during my career: comprehensive research, detailed analysis, clear value propositions, and realistic financial projections. The plan took me 3 weeks to complete, and by the time I finished, I had a 47-page document that laid out every aspect of the business from market analysis to operational procedure. Renaissanced Professional Services would operate as a hybrid between a consulting firm and a talent agency. We would maintain a curated network of experienced professionals in key business disciplines: finance, operations, marketing, human resources, strategic planning, and industry-specific expertise. We would work with clients to identify specific business challenges or staffing needs, then match them with professionals who had relevant experience and proven track record. The professionals would work as independent contractors on defined projects or part-time arrangements, with Renaissance handling client relationship management, quality assurance, and administrative support. Revenue would come from three sources: project fees charged to clients, ongoing retainer relationships with companies that needed regular access to expertise, and success bonuses tied to measurable outcomes achieved by our professionals. The financial projections were conservative but promising. I estimated that we could break even within 18 months and generate significant profits by the third year, assuming we could build a client base of 50 companies and a professional network of 200 experienced contractors. The competitive analysis showed that while there were employment agencies that worked with older job seekers and consulting firms that provided strategic expertise, no one was specifically addressing the intersection of these two markets. We would be creating a new category of professional services, but the section of the business plan that I was most proud of was the one that explained our competitive advantages. Renaissanced Professional Services wouldn't just be another consulting firm or employment agency. We would be the only organization in the market that truly understood both the challenges faced by experienced professionals and the real needs of businesses that could benefit from their expertise. We would have credibility with our target demographic because we were led by someone who had experienced age discrimination firsthand. We would have credibility with clients because we were led by someone who had built and run successful businesses for decades. We would understand the practical challenges of implementing strategic recommendations because our professionals would be people who had actually implemented similar recommendations in their own career. Most importantly, we would be positioned to change the conversation about age and employment by demonstrating that experience was a competitive advantage, not a liability. When I finished the business plan, I felt the same sense of accomplishment and anticipation that I had felt when completing major consulting proposals during my career. I had identified a significant market opportunity, developed a sound strategy for addressing it, and created a roadmap for building a successful business. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: the excitement of starting something entirely new, of creating value where none had existed before, of building something that could make a meaningful difference in the lives of thousands of people. I was 75 years old, supposedly unemployable, and about to become an entrepreneur again. The irony was delicious, but the opportunity was real. The next step was finding the right investors and partners to help me turn this vision into reality. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in Robert Chen's conference room, and I arrived 30 minutes early with 3 copies of the business plan, a laptop loaded with supporting data, and the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt since my first major client pitch 40 years early. At 75, I was about to ask someone to bet a significant amount of money on my ability to build something from nothing, and the weight of that responsibility felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Robert had invited 2 other potential investors to join the meeting: Sarah Martinez, who owned a successful marketing agency and had a reputation for investing in innovative service businesses, and Dr. William Hayes, a former university dean who had transitioned into private equity after retiring from academia. Both had experience with startup investments, though neither had ever been asked to consider funding a business launched by someone my age. I had spent the previous week rehearsing my presentation, anticipating questions, and preparing responses to every objection I could imagine. The most obvious concern would be my age and whether I had the energy and stamina to build a demanding business. The second would be market size and whether there were enough clients willing to pay premium prices for the services I was proposing. The
The third would be scalability and whether the business model could grow beyond my personal network and reputation. But as I sat in Robert's waiting area, reviewing my notes one final time, I realized that my biggest advantage might also be my biggest liability. My age gave me credibility with the demographic I wanted to serve, but it might make investors question my longevity and ability to execute a multi-year growth plan. Robert emerged from his office promptly at 9 o'clock, followed by Sarah and Dr. Hayes. Sarah was about 45, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested both success and creativity. Dr. Hayes appeared to be in his early 70s, with the dignified bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions based on careful analysis. "Joe, thank you for coming in," Robert said, as we settled around the conference table. "I've shared some preliminary information about your concept with Sarah and Bill, but I think it would be best if you walked us through the full presentation." I opened my laptop and began with the market analysis, explaining the demographic trends that were creating unprecedented opportunities in the intersection of aging and employment. I presented statistics about the growing population of experienced workers who were being pushed out of traditional employment, the increasing number of businesses struggling to find qualified talent, and the economic inefficiencies created by systematic age discrimination. Sarah leaned forward as I explained the size of the potential market. "Joe, these numbers are compelling, but I have to ask, if this opportunity is as obvious as you're making it sound, why isn't someone already doing this successfully?" It was exactly the question I had expected, and I had a detailed answer prepared. There are several reasons why this market has remained largely unaddressed. First, most employment agencies focus on volume placement rather than strategic match. They're trying to fill as many positions as possible, which means they gravitate toward younger candidates who fit standard job descriptions. Second, traditional consulting firms hire experienced professionals as employees, which creates overhead costs that make their services expensive for small and medium-sized businesses. They can't offer the flexibility that both clients and consultants want. Third, and most importantly, no one has approached this market with the right positioning. Everyone treats age as a problem to be overcome rather than as a value proposition to be marketed. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting perspective, Joe, but I'm curious about implementation. How do you ensure quality control when you're working with independent contractors? How do you manage client relationships when you're not directly supervising the work?" I had anticipated this concern as well, and I had developed detailed operational procedures to address it. Quality control starts with rigorous screening of our professional network. We wouldn't just verify credentials and experience, we'd conduct extensive interviews, check references, and require successful completion of a pilot project before adding anyone to our roster. For ongoing quality management, we'd implement a system of regular client feedback, project monitoring, and performance reviews. Each professional would have a dedicated relationship manager who would check in regularly and address any issues before they became problems. As for client relationship management, that's actually one of our key value propositions. Small businesses often need high-level expertise, but they don't have the experience to manage senior consultants effectively. We'd handle all the project management, communication, and coordination, allowing clients to focus on their core business while getting the expertise they need. Sarah asked about pricing and competitive positioning. "How do you price services like this? Are you competing with traditional employment agencies, consulting firms, or something else entirely?" This was where I felt most confident, because I had done extensive research on pricing models and competitive landscape. "We're creating a new category that sits between employment agencies and high-end consulting firms. Employment agencies typically charge 15 to 25% of the first year's salary for permanent placement. Major consulting firms charge anywhere from $150 to $400 per hour for strategic work. We'd price our services based on value delivered rather than time spent. For project work, we'd charge fixed fees based on scope and expected outcome. For ongoing arrangements, we'd use monthly retainers that give clients predictable costs and guaranteed access to expertise. Our rates would be higher than traditional employment agencies, but significantly lower than major consulting firms. A typical project might be priced at $20,000 to $30,000, delivered over 2 to 3 months by a professional who's actually solved similar problems before. Dr. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying the financial projections I had distributed. Joe, your revenue estimates seem conservative, which I appreciate, but I'm concerned about the time it will take to build the professional network and client base you need to reach profitability. What's your strategy for client acquisition in the first year? This question got to the heart of my growth strategy, and I was excited to explain how I plan to leverage my existing relationships and reputation. I have 3 primary channels for initial client acquisition. First, I have relationships with over 200 business owners from my years at Apex Solutions. Many of them have already expressed interest when I've discussed the concept informally. Second, I plan to use content marketing and thought leadership to establish Renaissance Professional Services as the authoritative voice on leveraging experienced talent. I'll write articles, speak at conferences, and participate in business forums to build awareness and credibility. Third, I'll partner with business organizations, chambers of commerce, and professional associations to reach companies that might benefit from our services. These organizations are already dealing with members who are struggling with staffing challenges. Sarah looked intrigued. What about the professional network? How do you recruit experienced consultants, and how do you ensure they'll be committed to working with you rather than pursuing other opportunities? I had thought carefully about this challenge because the success of the business would depend entirely on the quality and dedication of our professional network. Recruiting experienced professionals is actually easier than you might think, because there are thousands of highly qualified people who have been pushed out of traditional employment and are eager for meaningful work opportunities. The key is positioning the opportunity correctly. Instead of asking them to compete for traditional jobs, we're offering them a chance to be recognized as experts and paid accordingly. Instead of forcing them into full-time employment structures that might not suit their life circumstances, we're offering flexibility and autonomy. To ensure commitment, we'll structure our relationships as partnerships rather than traditional contractor arrangements. Our professionals will have input into service development, pricing, and business strategy. They'll share in the success of the business through performance bonuses and profit sharing. Robert had been quiet through most of the presentation, but now he asked the question I had been dreading. Joe, I have to address the elephant in the room. You're 75 years old, and building a business like this is going to require enormous energy and commitment over several years. How do you respond to concerns about your ability to execute this plan? I had rehearsed my answer to this question dozens of times, but when the moment came, I found myself responding from the heart rather than from my prepared script. Robert, that's a fair question, and I understand why investors would be concerned about my age. But I want you to consider what my age actually represents in the context of this business. First, I have more business experience than most entrepreneurs will accumulate in their entire career. I've built companies, managed complex operations, weathered economic downturns, and learned from failures that taught me invaluable lessons about what works and what doesn't. Second, my age gives me credibility with exactly the demographic I want to serve. A 30-year-old talking about the value of experienced workers sounds patronizing. A 75-year-old who has been personally victimized by age discrimination and is fighting back with a business solution that's authentic and powerful. Third, I'm not asking you to bet on my physical stamina. I'm asking you to bet on my intellectual capacity, my strategic thinking, and my ability to build and lead teams. Those capabilities don't diminish with age, they improve with experience. Finally, I have something most entrepreneurs don't have, the financial security to take big risks and make long-term decisions without being pressured by immediate cash flow needs. I can invest my own money, attract experienced partners, and build this business the right way because I'm not desperate for quick returns. The room was quiet for a moment after I finished speaking. Dr. Hayes was the first to respond, and his words surprised me. Joe, I'm 72 years old, and I've been involved in business and academia for over 50 years. Everything you just said resonates with me completely. The idea that someone becomes less capable at 75 is a myth perpetuated by people who haven't reached that age yet. Sarah nodded in agreement. I have to admit, Joe, your age initially made me skeptical, but listening to your presentation, I realize that you're not just selling a business concept, you're embodying the value proposition you're trying to market. If experienced professionals can provide strategic insight and practical wisdom that younger workers can't match, then you're the perfect example of that principle. Robert smiled and pulled out his checkbook. Joe, I've been looking forward to this moment since you first described your idea. I'm prepared to invest $200,000 in Renaissance Professional Services, and I'd like to discuss a formal partnership arrangement that gives me ongoing involvement in the strategic development of the business. Sarah leaned forward. I'm interested as well, but I'd like to propose something slightly different. Instead of just providing capital, I'd like to offer marketing and branding expertise. My agency could help you develop the messaging and positioning that will differentiate Renaissance in the marketplace. Dr. Hayes was more cautious. I need to review the full business plan more carefully, but I'm definitely interested in participating. This addresses a problem I've been thinking about in my own retirement planning. I have knowledge and experience that I'd like to continue using productively, but I don't want the constraints of traditional employment. As the meeting continued, I realized that something remarkable was happening. Instead of just pitching a business concept to potential investors, I was actually demonstrating the market demand for the services I was proposing. Hayes represented exactly the kind of experienced professional I wanted to recruit, and Sarah represented exactly the kind of business owner who might become a client. The conversation shifted from whether Renaissance Professional Services was a viable business to how quickly we could launch and begin serving clients. Sarah suggested starting with a pilot program involving a small number of carefully selected professionals and clients, allowing us to refine our processes and build case studies before scaling up. Dr. Hayes offered to help recruit other experienced professionals from his network of former academic and business colleagues. I know dozens of people who would be perfect for this kind of arrangement, he said. Retired executives, former professors, technical experts who still have tremendous value to offer but want flexible work arrangement. Robert proposed a timeline that would have us operational within 3 months, starting with basic infrastructure and expanding our capabilities as we proved the concept and refined our service delivery. By the end of the meeting, I had secured initial funding of $350,000, established partnerships with 2 experienced business professionals, and developed a concrete launch plan that addressed every aspect of business development from legal structure to marketing strategy. But more importantly, I had validated my central hypothesis that there was genuine demand for the services Renaissance Professional Services would provide. The enthusiasm and engagement of my potential investors proved that I wasn't chasing a theoretical opportunity. I was addressing a real market need that sophisticated business people recognized immediately. As we wrapped up the meeting, Sarah asked a question that would shape everything that followed. Joe, what's your ultimate vision for this business? Are you thinking about a regional consulting firm, or do you see potential for something big? I had been thinking about scale and growth potential throughout the business planning process, and I had developed some ambitious ideas about what Renaissance Professional Services could become. Sarah, I think we're looking at the beginning of a fundamental shift in how society thinks about aging and employment. The demographic trends that are creating this opportunity in Chicago are happening everywhere in the developed world.
If we can prove this concept works, there's no reason why Renaissance Professional Services couldn't become a national organization with regional offices in every major metropolitan area. We could be the company that transforms how businesses access experienced talent and how experienced professionals continue contributing their expertise. But beyond just business growth, I think we have an opportunity to change the cultural conversation about age and work. Instead of seeing aging as a problem to be managed, we could help society recognize it as a resource to be leveraged. Dr. Hayes nodded enthusiastically. Joe, that's exactly the kind of vision that gets me excited about this investment. You're not just starting a business, you're launching a movement. After the meeting, I drove home in a state of euphoria mixed with terror. I had just committed to building a business that would require every bit of experience, energy, and strategic thinking I possessed. I had taken on investors who would expect results and partners who would depend on my leadership. At 75, I was about to become a startup founder, competing in a marketplace that supposedly had no place for someone my age. The irony was perfect, but the challenge was real. That evening, I called Clara to share the news about our successful investor meeting. She had been waiting anxiously for the results, and her excitement was infectious when I described the enthusiasm of our new partners. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is incredible. When do we start? What do we need to do first?" I had been thinking about implementation priorities throughout the drive home, and I had developed a clear sequence of activities that would get us operational as quickly as possible. First, we need to establish the legal structure and business infrastructure. Robert is helping us with incorporation, banking, and insurance. Sarah is working on branding and marketing materials. Second, we need to recruit our initial network of experienced professionals. Hayes is helping with that, but I want to start with people I know personally so we can ensure quality and reliability from the beginning. Third, we need to identify our first clients and pilot projects. I want to start with businesses where I have existing relationships and credibility, so we can focus on service delivery rather than sales. Clara was taking notes as I outlined the launch plan. "What do you need me to do? What's my role in all of this?" I had been thinking about Clara's contribution throughout the planning process, and I had some specific ideas about how her skills could support our growth. "Clara, I want you to be our director of operations. You'll be responsible for client relationship management, project coordination, and quality assurance. You understand how I work, you know how to manage complex projects, and you have the communication skills to represent Renaissance professionals. Also, you'll be our connection to younger professionals and businesses. One of our competitive advantages is that we bridge generational gaps in the workplace. I bring experience and credibility with older professionals, but you bring understanding of how younger business leaders think and communicate." Clara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Miss Mitchell, 6 months ago I thought my career was over when Apex was acquired. Now you're offering me the chance to help build something that could change thousands of lives. I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by helping me prove that experience and wisdom are still valuable in a world that's forgotten how to recognize them." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork, strategic planning, and infrastructure development. Robert helped us establish Renaissance Professional Services as a limited liability company with appropriate partnership agreements and investment structure. Sarah's marketing team developed a professional website, promotional materials, and messaging that positioned us as strategic consultants, rather than employment services. But the most important work was building our network of experienced professionals. I started by reaching out to former colleagues, clients, and industry contacts, who I knew had been affected by age discrimination or forced retirement. The response was overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, I had conducted phone interviews with 47 experienced professionals, representing expertise in finance, operations, marketing, human resources, strategic planning, and industry-specific knowledge across manufacturing, healthcare, retail, and professional service. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. I would explain the Renaissance concept and gauge their interest in flexible consulting arrangements. Invariably, they would become excited about the possibility of continuing to use their expertise productively, while maintaining control over their schedules and commitment. But the most revealing part of these conversations was learning about their experiences with traditional job searches and employment agents. Story after story of resumes that disappeared into online application systems, interviews where they could sense immediate age bias, and agencies that treated them as damaged goods seeking charity rather than experienced professionals offering value. Margaret Sullivan, the former bank vice president I had met months earlier, was one of the first people I recruited. When I explained how Renaissance would position her expertise and market her services, she started crying. "You're the first person in 2 years who has talked about my experience as an asset rather than a liability." I was starting to believe that maybe I really was obsolete, that everything I learned in 30 years of banking was worthless in today's market. Harold Peterson, the former quality control manager, had a similar reaction. I've been trying to tell people that quality problems are predictable and preventable if you know what to look for. But every company I talk to acts like experience is a substitute for intelligence, rather than a complement to it." Patricia Anderson, the former marketing director, was the most articulate about the psychological impact of prolonged unemployment and age discrimination. What you're offering isn't just work, it's dignity. You're treating us like experts rather than refugees, And that changes everything about how we see ourselves and our prospects. As I built our professional network, I also began reaching out to potential clients. I started with business owners I had worked with during my years at Apex Solutions, explaining how Renaissance could provide them with access to strategic expertise they might not be able to afford as full-time employees. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. David Rosenberg, the logistics company owner, became our first official client, signing a contract for Harold Peterson to conduct a comprehensive review of his quality control processes and train his younger managers on best practices. Jennifer Walsh, the boutique hotel owner, signed Margaret Sullivan for a 6-month project to help her expand into new markets, leveraging Margaret's expertise in commercial lending and business development to secure financing and establish banking relationships. Dr. Richard Fleming, who owned a chain of medical practices, hired Patricia Anderson to develop marketing strategies that would appeal to multiple generations of patients, while maintaining the professional reputation his practices had built over decades. Within 6 weeks of our investor meeting, Renaissance Professional Services had placed 12 experienced professionals in consulting arrangements with 8 different clients. The projects ranged from strategic planning and operational improvements to specialized expertise in regulatory compliance and market development. But more importantly, we were already seeing measurable results that validated our value proposition. Harold's quality control review had identified process improvements that saved David's logistics company over $40,000 in the first month. Margaret's banking relationships had secured Jennifer better financing terms than she had expected for her expansion plan. Patricia's marketing campaigns had increased patient inquiries for Dr. Fleming's practices by 35%. These early successes created a virtuous cycle of referrals and word-of-mouth marketing that accelerated our growth beyond my most optimistic projections. Satisfied clients referred us to other business owners, and successful professionals referred other experienced experts who wanted to join our network. By the end of our 3rd month of operation, Renaissance Professional Services had 27 professionals in our network and contracts with 15 client companies. We were generating monthly revenue that exceeded our operating expenses, and we had a pipeline of potential projects that would keep us busy through the rest of the year. But the real validation came when Marcus Webb called. I was in our office, reviewing project reports and planning our expansion into Milwaukee, when Clara transferred a call that made me smile with satisfaction. "Joe, this is Marcus. I hope you're doing well." The conversation was awkward and stilted, as it should have been given our history, but Marcus eventually got to the point. Consolidated Dynamics was struggling with integration challenges in their acquired companies, and they needed expertise in change management and organizational development. "Joe, I know this might be uncomfortable given how things ended between us, but we could really use your help on a project." I let the silence stretch for a moment, remembering the days security guards had escorted me out of the Meridian Tower with my cardboard box of personal belongings. "Marcus, I'd be happy to discuss how Renaissance Professional Services might be able to help Consolidated Dynamics. Clara can send you our standard consulting agreement and fee structure." "Joe, I was hoping we could work something out personally, given our history." "Marcus, our history is exactly why this needs to go through proper business channels, but I'm confident Renaissance can provide the expertise you need." The contract with Consolidated Dynamics was worth $600,000 over 8 months. They were essentially paying Renaissance more money than they had been willing to pay me as a full-time CEO, and we were delivering results through a team of experienced professionals who understood both strategic planning and practical implementation. More importantly, the success of that project led to additional contracts with other companies that Consolidated had acquired, each one validating our business model and demonstrating the value of experienced professionals working in flexible arrangement. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that humiliating day in the unemployment office, I realized that Tommy Rodriguez had been completely wrong about my employability. I wasn't unemployable. I was unemployable only within the narrow constraints of traditional employment structures that weren't designed for someone with my experience and preference. By creating new structures that leveraged rather than ignored my age and experience, I had discovered that I wasn't just employable, I was more valuable than ever.
And I had built a business that was proving the same thing for hundreds of other experienced professionals who had been discarded by a system that didn't understand their work. Renaissance Professional Services was no longer just a business, it was becoming a movement that was changing how companies thought about talent and how experienced professionals thought about their careers. We were proving that unemployable was just another word for undervalued by people who don't understand value, and we were just getting started. 5 years later, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Aging and Employment, looking out at an audience of business leaders, policymakers, and researchers who had come to hear about the Renaissance model that was transforming how America thought about experienced workers. The organization that had started with me, Clara, and a handful of professionals working out of a modest office suite, now operated in 32 states with over 2,000 consultants, and had facilitated work arrangements worth more than $50 million. The success had exceeded every projection in my original business plan, but more importantly, it had proven that age discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was economically wasteful on a scale that few people had understood. Renaissance Professional Services had become the case study that universities used to teach about demographic disruption and market innovation, but to me it remained what it had always been: proof that society's discards often contain hidden treasure. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Each year had brought new challenges that tested our model and forced us to evolve our approach. The second year had required us to develop more sophisticated quality control systems as we scaled beyond my personal network. The third year had demanded significant investment in technology platforms that could manage complex matching algorithms and project tracking across multiple states. The fourth year had brought regulatory challenges as traditional employment agencies lobbied for restrictions on our business model. But each challenge had ultimately strengthened our position by forcing us to become more professional, more efficient, and more valuable to both our consultants and our clients. We had survived and thrived not despite the obstacles but because of them. The audience at the conference included several faces I recognized from my journey. Tommy Rodriguez, the unemployment caseworker who had declared me unemployable, was sitting in the third row, having requested an invitation after reading about Renaissance in a government report on workforce innovation. Hayes, now our board chairman, was introducing me with the kind of academic precision that made our credibility unquestionable. Sarah Martinez, whose marketing expertise had helped us develop the messaging that positioned experience as a premium service, was preparing to present our latest research on intergenerational workforce strategy. Robert Chen, who had evolved from investor to chief financial officer, was scheduled to discuss the economic impact of what media outlets had dubbed the silver workforce revolution. But the presence that meant the most to me was Clara, now our chief operating officer, who had built the operational systems that allowed Renaissance to scale without losing the personal touch that differentiated us from traditional consulting firms. She had grown from my assistant to my business partner, proving that mentorship and professional development weren't just services we provided to clients, they were values we lived internally. As I began my presentation, I thought about how different this felt from that morning in the unemployment office when I had been told my working life was over. The woman who had sat in that plastic chair, holding a folder full of minimum wage job listings, felt like someone I had known in a previous lifetime. That woman had been defeated, confused, and convinced that her value had disappeared along with her employment status. The woman standing before this audience had learned that value isn't determined by other people's recognition. It's created by your ability to solve problems and serve others in ways that matter. Age hadn't diminished that ability, it had refined it, concentrated it, and given it the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of experience navigating complex challenges. I talked about Margaret Sullivan, who had become our most successful financial consultant and had helped dozens of small businesses secure funding and develop sustainable growth strategies. I described Harold Peterson, whose quality control expertise had saved client companies millions of dollars while training a new generation of quality professionals. I highlighted Patricia Anderson, whose marketing campaigns had helped traditional businesses reach new customers while maintaining their core brand identities. These weren't charity cases or sympathy hires. They were strategic business decisions that created measurable value for everyone involved. Companies got access to expertise they couldn't afford to hire full-time, experienced professionals got meaningful work that respected their knowledge while accommodating their life preferences. Younger workers got mentorship and training that accelerated their professional development. But the real transformation had been cultural. Renaissance professional services had helped change the conversation about aging and work from a problem to be managed to an opportunity to be leveraged. We had shown that the choice wasn't between youth and experience, it was between rigid thinking and creative solutions. The questions from the audience reflected how thoroughly the landscape had shifted since I started this journey. Instead of asking whether older workers could be productive, they were asking how to access experienced talent most effectively. Instead of viewing age as a liability, they were discussing it as a competitive advantage in industries where relationships, judgment, and institutional knowledge mattered more than raw energy. A young entrepreneur from Silicon Valley asked how she could recruit experienced advisors for her startup without the overhead of traditional employment. A government official wanted to know how the Renaissance model could be adapted for public sector organizations struggling with knowledge transfer as baby boomers retired. A venture capitalist inquired about franchising opportunities that could bring our services to smaller markets. Each question validated what I had discovered during those months of research and planning. There was massive unmet demand for the services we provided, and we had barely scratched the surface of the potential market. But the question that touched me most deeply came from a woman about my age who identified herself as a recently laid-off marketing executive. "Mitchell, how do you respond to people who say you should be grateful for what you've accomplished and just enjoy your retirement instead of continuing to work?" I thought about that question for a moment, remembering all the well-meaning friends and family members who had suggested I take up gardening or travel the world instead of starting a business. The implication had always been that continued work was somehow unseemly for someone my age, as if productivity and contribution had expiration dates. I respond by asking them to consider what they're really saying. They're suggesting that experience, knowledge, and the desire to contribute meaningful value to society become inappropriate after a certain birthday. They're arguing that society benefits when experienced professionals withdraw from productive activity, rather than continuing to share their expertise. But more fundamentally, they're misunderstanding what work means to people who have spent decades building careers and developing expertise. For many of us, work isn't just about earning money, it's about identity, purpose, and the satisfaction that comes from solving problems and helping others succeed. Retirement might be the right choice for some people, but it shouldn't be the only socially acceptable choice for everyone over a certain age. We should have the same right as younger people to determine our own relationship with work based on our interests, capabilities, and life circumstance. The applause that followed was more than polite. It was enthusiastic in a way that suggested I had articulated something many people felt but hadn't been able to express. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of people who wanted to share their own stories of age discrimination, successful career transitions, or innovative approaches to leveraging experienced talent. The networking reception became an impromptu support group for professionals who had been written off by traditional employment systems, but refused to accept that verdict. Tommy Rodriguez introduced himself during the reception, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. "Mitchell, I want to apologize for what I said that day, in the unemployment office. I was young and inexperienced, and I had no idea what I was talking about." I smiled at him, remembering how his casual dismissal had stung at the time, but had ultimately catalyzed everything that followed. "Tommy, you don't need to apologize. You were working within a system that wasn't designed to recognize the value of experienced workers. But I hope you'll remember this conversation the next time you meet someone who's been told they're unemployable." "Actually," he said, "I've been following Renaissance's model in my work. When I meet older job seekers now, I try to help them think about alternative approaches rather than just traditional employment. You've changed how I do my job." That conversation encapsulated the broader impact Renaissance professional services had achieved beyond our direct business results. We had influenced how employment counselors, HR professionals, and business leaders thought about age and work. We had provided a successful model that other organizations could adapt and replicate. But perhaps most importantly, we had proven that innovation could come from unexpected sources, that solutions to complex social problems could emerge from the people most affected by those problems, and that age could be an asset rather than a liability in entrepreneurship and business leadership. As the conference concluded and I prepared to return to Chicago, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that humiliating unemployment office encounter to this moment of recognition and influence. The path hadn't been linear or predictable, but each step had built on the previous one in ways that created momentum and credibility. The business metrics were impressive. Renaissance Professional Services employed over 300 full-time staff members, maintained a network of more than 2,000 experienced consultants, and had facilitated work arrangements that generated over $18 million annually for professionals who had been told they were unemployable. But the human metrics were even more meaningful. We had helped thousands of experienced professionals rediscover their value and continue contributing their expertise productively. We had assisted hundreds of businesses solve complex challenges and improve their operations through access to knowledge they couldn't have afforded otherwise. Most importantly, we had demonstrated that demographic change could be an opportunity rather than a threat, that aging could be leveraged rather than merely managed, and that society benefited when all generations could contribute their unique strengths to solving shared challenges. The flight home gave me time to think about what came next. At 79, I was frequently asked about succession planning and whether I intended to step back from active leadership of Renaissance. The question always amused me, because it reflected the same age-based assumptions that had created the market opportunity we were serving. Why should I step back from work I found fulfilling and was clearly performing effectively? Why should chronological age matter more than actual capability and results? Why should society expect me to withdraw from productive activity when I was demonstrating that experience could be a competitive advantage? I had no intention of retiring in any traditional sense, but I was thinking seriously about evolution and growth. Renaissance Professional Services had proven the concept and established the market, but there were opportunities to expand our impact through partnerships, licensing and policy advocacy. We were already working with several universities to develop curriculum around age-inclusive workforce strategies. We had consulting contracts with government agencies interested in adapting our model for public sector application. We were exploring international expansion opportunities in countries facing similar demographic challenges. But the opportunity that excited me most was developing Renaissance into a platform that could support multiple approaches to leveraging experienced talent. Instead of just matching consultants with projects, we could become the infrastructure that enabled innovative employment arrangements, mentorship programs, and knowledge transfer initiatives across entire industry. As my plane descended into Chicago, I could see the city skyline that had been the backdrop for both my greatest professional triumph and my most humiliating defeat. The Meridian Tower where I had been escorted out by security guards was visible in the distance, a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when you refuse to accept other people's definitions of your work. Renaissance Professional Services now occupied 4 floors of a building just 6 blocks from Meridian Tower, but the real distance between those two locations couldn't be measured in city blocks. It was the distance between being told you're unemployable and employing hundreds of people. It was the distance between accepting society's verdict about your obsolescence and proving that experience was more valuable than ever. The young caseworker who had declared me unemployable 5 years earlier wasn't wrong about the traditional job market, but he was thinking too small. He was operating within a system that forced 75-year-olds to compete with 25-year-olds for the same entry-level positions, and in that system age discrimination was both predictable and devastating. We had created a different system, one where experience competed with innovation rather than being overwhelmed by it, where wisdom complemented energy rather than being replaced by it, and where the accumulated knowledge of decades became a strategic advantage rather than a burden. Today, Renaissance Professional Services was proof that unemployable was just another word for undervalued by people who don't understand value. We had shown that sometimes the best response to being discarded was to build something so successful that the people who threw you away ended up paying premium prices to access what they had lost. More importantly, we had demonstrated that age discrimination wasn't just unfair to individuals. It was economically wasteful on a scale that cost society billions of dollars in lost productivity and unrealized potential. The unemployment office where Tommy Rodriguez had delivered his devastating verdict was still operating a few miles from our headquarters, still helping people navigate a job market that too often measured worth by the wrong criteria. But now it was also one of our most productive recruiting locations, because we had learned that other people's discards often contained exactly the expertise that forward-thinking companies needed most. I was 79 years old, supposedly past any reasonable expectation of productivity or innovation, and next quarter we were opening our 16th regional office while launching a new division focused on helping companies develop age-inclusive culture. The world had told me I was finished, but I had decided to show them I was just getting started, and that choice had made all the difference, not just for me, but for thousands of other experienced professionals who had discovered that their best work might still be ahead of them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them.